I am very excited this morning to have this program. You'll see up here on the screen what kind of Christianity, a history of slavery and anti-Black racism in the Presbyterian Church. Last weekend, several of our congregation members joined myself and Reverend Natalie for a tour of the African Burial Ground National Monument downtown. It was a very moving experience, and it is free. This is my little plug there. It is free for you to go anytime and check that out. It was a really good precursor looking at the history of slavery in New York City, of which we are all a part of, to this event of looking at slavery in the Presbyterian Church. I am really thrilled to be welcoming Dr. William Yu, who is an associate professor of American religious and cultural history at Columbia Theological Seminary. He has published books on African American Christianity, Asian American Christianity, and Presbyterian history, including What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Presbyterian Church, which is the winner of the 2023 Award of Excellence from the Religion Communicators Council. As a teacher, preacher, and scholar, Yu focuses on the history of racism in American Christianity. He's a professor and public theologian who interprets challenging and urgent issues of racial justice with clarity, depth, honesty, and precision. So welcome, Dr. Yu, and thank you so much for joining us.
I'm very grateful to Jamie and everyone here at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian for inviting me. It is just a pleasure and delight to be able to share some of my research and teaching with you. So much of what I'm going to share is accepting Jamie's invitation. I don't want to be a bad guest, if you will, is about what kind of Christianity. But I am also going to blend some from a new book that I've been working on roughly from 2023, and that will see the light of day in about 9 or 10 days. It's published at the end of January, also with Westminster John Knox Press, and you can see the title there. It is a broader view, not just of slavery and Presbyterianism, but really thinking about the founding of this country and the making of American Christianity in light of both settler colonialism and slavery across perhaps Protestant Christianity. So with that, let me start with something from a question that I began What Kind of Christianity the book with, because not only was it a question for the book, but it was a question that had been searing in my mind and heart for years, from the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, a womanist theologian and the first Black American woman to be ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1974. And one of the images here is actually in New York City, where Dr. Cannon received her PhD from Union Theological Seminary. Roughly in 1987, she asked, quote, "Where was the church and Christian believers when Black women and Black men, Black boys and Black girls were being raped, sexually abused, lynched, assassinated, castrated, and physically oppressed? What kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to Blacks, these same rights which had been given to others without question?" End quote. So I really wanted to get at it. And so at one level, I think many of us know the answer to Dr. Cannon's question is the wrong kind of Christianity. But what I really wanted to get at still is, if it was the wrong kind of Christianity, why was it practiced by so many white Christians, churches, and denominations, including the denomination or the tradition to which I belong, American Presbyterianism? Here's another observation, and this is from Reckoning with History. After the American Civil War, again, another New York minister, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, reflected on the relationship between churches and Black liberation. Beecher, as we know, belonged to a family of abolitionists, including his more famous sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe. I do wonder if there was some sibling rivalry there. But Henry Ward Beecher acknowledged that sometimes he hesitated to support the cause of abolition when he was the pastor of several congregations, including Second Presbyterian in Indianapolis and Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. Though the abolitionist movement pursued God's justice in seeking to end slavery, Beecher acknowledged, quote, "Churches dreaded abolitionism, parties hated abolitionism, commerce abhorred abolitionism. Mobs rioted around the meetings and threatened the dwellings, the stores, and the very persons of abolitionists, end quote. Henry Ward Beecher also named William Lloyd Garrison as the nation's most despised abolitionist. A good number of Christian individuals participated in abolitionism, including white Christians such as Garrison, but fewer churches were active in one of the most significant social justice movements in U.S. history. In 1835, Samuel J. May, a white abolitionist working with the New England Anti-Slavery Society and a good friend of William Lloyd Garrison, he encountered a white merchant at a Presbyterian church in New York City where they were seeking to mobilize. The merchant asked May to walk out of the church with him so they could converse more freely. Once outside on the street, the merchant explained, quote, "Mr. May, we are not such fools as not to know that slavery is a great evil, a great wrong. But it was consented to by the founders of our republic. It was provided for in the Constitution of our Union. A great portion of the property of the Southerners is invested under its sanction, and the business of the North, as well as the South, has become adjusted to it," end quote. The merchant shared that his opposition to abolitionists like Samuel J. May, therefore, it's not over a matter of principle, but rather it revolved around a matter of business necessity. The point there the merchant was sharing with May, or one of the points, is you're up there from these pulpits and you're haranguing us and you're telling us about how wrong slavery it is, it's immoral and the like. And what I'm sharing with you is that I don't disagree with you about the principles, but I want you to look more carefully, think about the economics, and think about, as he wrote, the business necessity. In 1837, a white Presbyterian layperson and a wealthy child of New York landowners, Gerrit Smith, he therefore explained that a large proportion of white Christians in the northern states refused to take a stand against slavery for economic and social reasons. Slavery was, as Gerrit Smith understood it, a foundational reality in their lives, including in New York City, and that many, therefore, preferred the world as they knew it, even with the evils of slavery and anti-black racism, over the uncertainties of deconstructing this world and reconstructing a new one in closer accordance with the teachings of Jesus Christ. Smith therefore argued that the response of not all, but perhaps too many white Christians to slavery therefore revealed that the governing principle of their faith was, and these are haunting words, and this is a kind of prophetic criticism, not unlike someone like Amos or Micah in the Old Testament, the doctrine of expediency. And in part, this pamphlet or essay that he wrote in 1837, in some ways it is a response to Charles Hodge, some of you may know, theology professor at Princeton Seminary, for his pro-slavery, reluctant, but nonetheless strong pro-slavery defenses 1 year earlier in 1836. And so Smith was saying, Hodge insists to us that the reason we must not support abolitionism and continue to, whether it be quietly or complicitly, but nonetheless defend slavery, is because it's a matter of biblical authority. We have to follow the interpretation of the Scripture. It's the doctrine of Scripture that Hodge says leads us. Whereas Smith is saying that's not it. It is the doctrine of expediency. And so one sad and shameful example of expediency that I found in my research comes from another Princeton Seminary professor, Archibald Alexander, pastor, seminary professor, moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, I think 1800, 1810. But he was actually, some of you may know more than me, he was the first professor at Princeton Seminary and taught there for a little over 4 decades, 1812, 13, through the 1850s. But Alexander endorsed the American Colonization Society, the ACS, a movement centered in the northern states. It was not popular in the southern states. They did not support this. To send free black Americans to Liberia. And why it was not popular in the southern states is that some did feel it was kind of a ruse, kind of a way to convince them to support abolitionism. But some did support it. Some did want to manumit or free their enslaved persons so that they could go to Liberia. But this movement was really to send free black Americans to Liberia. And Archibald Alexander explained, it was the idea that the discriminatory contempt that white Americans, including white Christians, held against black Americans was too insurmountable to overcome. In 1846, you can see the book right up there, Alexander wrote that anti-black racism was wrong. It was irrational. It was unreasonable. But he also submitted that it was powerful. And he didn't commit to working toward racial equality. Instead of teaching white Christians to repent of their sins of racial prejudice, Alexander preferred that black Americans, those who were free and those who he had prayed and hoped would be free, would leave this country and find another home on the African continent where their skin color would not be so despised. I think early in this book he writes, if I were a man of color, would I want to stay here where I have little opportunity for dignity and growth and the like, or would I go to another continent where my skin color would not be so despised? We can get into some of the challenges of this colonization movement in Liberia. But what I also found from one of Archibald Alexander's students, the first black graduate of Princeton Seminary, class of 1828, Theodore S. Wright, who after graduating from Princeton became a black Presbyterian minister right here in New York City. He helped to lead black opposition to the ACS and this larger colonization movement. Wright co-authored with Samuel Eli Cornish, one of his mentors and friends, another black Presbyterian minister in New York City, and Cornish was a journalist who founded the first African-American newspaper, Freeman's Journal. They together wrote several articles, including one essay that rebutted several of the main thrusts of the colonization movement as immoral, irrational, and anti-Christian. They began this work with a searing rebuke of the exclusively white membership of the ACS. The ACS was an organization professing to work on behalf of black persons. But Wright and Cornish and others noted that they didn't actually consult or include any black persons in their work. The ACS therefore propagated racist and false ideas that black Americans universally or almost universally denounced. ACS members spuriously claimed that African Americans yearned in their hearts for Africa, and therefore they welcomed the opportunity to migrate to Liberia, if given the material support and financial resources to do so, because it's an expensive enterprise, transatlantic travel. Cornish and Wright said, actually, African Americans would tell you that what we yearned for in our hearts was equal rights and equal access to education and employment right here in this country, the United States. Cornish and Wright also challenged the ACS for accommodating rather than combating the anti-black racism of white Christians. Cornish and Wright charged the ACS with promoting, and this is, I think, a really quite brilliant theological argument. In addition to thinking about culturally, racially, and socially, they said theologically, the ACS is promoting a powerless gospel that surrenders to anti-black racism as an unconquerable sin, that it is not even something that God can help us to overcome. They took the racial claims of the ACS to their theological conclusion, and I'm quoting from their essay. To this end, there is in the white man an inherent prejudice against his colored brother, so fixed that its removal, whilst the latter remains in this country, is not only beyond all human power, but beyond Christianity itself, the power of God. But that it might surely be mitigated, at least, if not extinguished, provided the Atlantic Ocean could be made to roll between them. The solution to anti-black racism, according to Cornish and Wright, was the repentance of white Christians, not the removal of black Americans. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, in the inaugural issue of his abolitionist newspaper, which probably became the most well-known and the most significant, The Liberator, he explained that the aim of his abolitionist newspaper was to, quote, strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population, end quote, adding that he would not apologize for his use of abrasive and accusatory language, which some white Christians, including probably Presbyterians like Archibald Alexander, found inflammatory and unchristlike. Garrison deemed it necessary to be, quote, as harsh as truth, because he hated the kind of Christianity that appealed to gradual abolition. He hated the kind of Christianity, and he wrote about this 1 year later in 1832, that continued to appeal to African or Liberian colonization and other moderate compromises. He wrote in this January 1st, 1831 editorial introducing the Liberator newspaper. Quote, "Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hand of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present," end quote. But what I did find is that some white Presbyterians, again, I don't want to say all, some, and I'll get to kind of how we can understand this, they would not relent to prioritizing ecclesial unity, denominational unity, over black liberation. The commissioners at the PCUSA Old School General Assembly. So real quick, in 1837, there was a divide in the Presbyterian Church denomination. It was the PC in the USA. And this is not like what later historians called them when looking back, old school, new school. This is actually what they called themselves. New school, old school, cool school, I don't know what. But there was no cool school denomination. But there was a old school and a new school, and some of the division came over theological disagreements about the doctrine of original sin. So both old school and new school Presbyterians believed in human depravity. They believed that humans were sinners in need of God's grace, and that with God's grace, of course, all things were possible for Christians. But the question became, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, perhaps ask the good ministers here at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian. It is, where does sin come from? And so for the old school Presbyterians, it comes from an inheritance or an imputation of Adam's sin. That sin comes from original sin, comes from what happened in the fall, and so that all human beings are sinners. That in Adam, all have sinned, and in Christ, all can be forgiven and raised. I think that's Romans 5. So new school Presbyterians, such as Albert Barnes, this pastor, prominent pastor in Philadelphia, they argued, yes, humans are all sinners, but sin, to use their language back then, sin consists in the sinning. We're not sinners because we've inherited this sinful condition from Adam. We're sinners because we sin, because we make mistakes and we fall short and we have selfish thoughts and actions and the like. And so Albert Barnes and other New School Presbyterians did not appreciate what they saw as a kind of overly fatalistic view of old school Presbyterians and their understanding of the doctrine of original sin and where sin comes from. Sin to them doesn't come from Adam, but sin comes from our own sin. But again, both believed strongly and deeply in the abounding, powerful love of God and forgiveness of God in the meritorious work of Christ and what was possible. Again, the challenge there that Cornish and Wright and others say is, if all things are possible, what about ending racism? What about ending slavery? And so part of that divide in 1836 and 1837, some of it, slavery was there. But what is hard is for those historians who argue, and there are a few who do, that the 1837 old school, new school divide was primarily about slavery. That is hard for me, this historian, to believe because there were many prominent pro-slavery Presbyterians that remained in the new school denomination because it was a national denomination until 1857-58. But so nonetheless, so you have this thing, this is the old school. So I guess what we can say, when I did all that stuff, we would say the more theologically, socially conservative denomination, the old school General Assembly. So they were meeting, and they met in 1845. And this was a big deal in 1845 in Cincinnati, because they understood, it was probably roughly that May and June is when they met for about 2 weeks. They understood that actions and schisms among the other two large, if you will, mainstream Protestant denominations, Methodists and Baptists, it made it nearly impossible for them to further prevent or postpone a decision on slavery. So at that 1836 General Assembly, that's 9 years ago, there was a lot of deliberation, discussion, and prayer about what we do about slavery because of the growth of the abolition movement. And that's where in 1836, Hodge reluctantly wrote about slavery in April 1836, 1 month before the General Assembly met then in Pittsburgh in May 1836. My point there is that it was related, it was connected. First, why did Hodge wait so long when he wrote about just about every other darn thing in the church and the world and the nation? My sense is he didn't really want to write about slavery. But he did because he felt like denominational stakes and unity were at hand. And so there at that General Assembly, when I've looked through the minutes, and you can too, it's all public domain, they do come to it and they say, the decision that we've made is that we're going to indefinitely postpone any further discussion and deliberation on slavery. That's what they said in 1836. And what I will say is that in that time period, that was also what was happening in the government of the United States, I think in the House of Representatives. Some even here may know this more than me, that there was also their decision to table all discussions and resolution on slavery. And after he was president and he lost to Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, I don't know how many presidents do this today, he became a congressman representing his district in Massachusetts at the U.S. House of Representatives. And he was a strong kind of abolitionist. And he did say, and this is where it comes from, it is like for us not to be able to talk or do anything about slavery in the halls of Congress, it's like it is as if you are putting a gag in my mouth. And that's where kind of the gag rule comes from. And so that too was in operation in the U.S. House of Representatives for several years because of the threat of national schism and division. And so that also was happening in the Presbyterian Church, USA Old School, New School as well. But finally, why in 1845? It is because the Methodists divided in 1844. There was, long story short, there was a bishop who, through marriage, had inherited enslaved persons in Georgia. James Andrew was his name. He's connected to Emory University. And then ultimately, again, not all, but a sufficient number of northern white Methodists were like, hey, he can't be a bishop. He can be part of our church and he can do a lot of things, but he just can't be a bishop and oversee these things. And of course, southern white Methodists were appalled that there was this opposition to his appointment as a bishop. And ultimately, right here in New York City, the Methodist Episcopal Church divided and voted to divide in 1844. And that's why for a long time there was the MEC, Methodist Episcopal Church, and MECS, Methodist Episcopal Church, South. And they reunited, I think, 1930s, sorry. So that was there. And then the Baptists, they also divided in 1845. And similarly, it was over the idea of supporting enslavers who would be world missionaries. And a sufficient number, I don't want to say all and I don't want to overstate it, but a sufficient number of Northern White Baptists said, look, we can't do that. We can't appoint them and commission them to be missionaries all over the world with their connections to slavery. And there too, there was a division. So finally, for the Presbyterians who met in 1845, there was this sense that we're going to have to do something about slavery and what is happening. And so on the third day, a special committee was appointed, and they were appointed and they were given the task that before this General Assembly ends, you all need to make a recommendation. As the committee met to prepare the report, its members agreed that church unity was their most important commitment, and they consulted with several commissioners from the southern states, including James Henley Thornwell, a commissioner from the Charleston Presbytery and professor of biblical studies and theology at the College of South Carolina College, which is now the University of South Carolina. And Thornwell emerged as one of the leading voices in these gatherings. Thornwell was one of the brightest thinkers among white Presbyterians in his region. In 1847, he was founding editor of the Theological Journal, Southern Presbyterian Review, and in 1855, he joined the faculty of the seminary where I teach, Columbia Theological Seminary. So Thornwell wrote his wife, Nancy Witherspoon Thornwell, from Cincinnati, to share about his crucial work, staving off the implementation of a former position against slavery. He wrote to his, I think he started it really, my dear wife, but later on he says, quote, "The question of slavery has been brought before the House and referred to a special committee of 7. Though not a member of the committee, I've been consulted on the subject and have drawn up a paper, which I think the committee and the assembly will substantially adopt. And if they do, abolitionism will be killed in the Presbyterian Church, at least for the present." Thornwell's paper, which the committee advanced as its own, emphasized the spirituality of the church, which meant that the General Assembly's leadership and jurisdiction pertained only to the religious faith and moral conduct of its members. Presbyterians were not permitted to, quote, "legislate where Christ has not legislated," end quote. And in this, Thornwell devised a way to reorient abolitionist appeals into a single question that was less about the atrocities of slavery, which were coming up in these petitions, General Assembly, you've got to address this and that, and more about interpretations of scriptural authority. The committee recommended that the General Assembly address the following question, quote, do the scriptures teach that the holding of slaves without regard to circumstances is a sin, the renunciation of which should be made a condition of membership in the Church of Christ, end quote. In presenting the decision on slavery in this matter, Thornwell built on Charles Hodge's pro-slavery contention from 1836 that Presbyterians lacked explicit biblical warrant to declare slavery as sinful. And Thornwell advanced his own argument restricting the authority of the Presbyterian Church, capital C, to doctrinal matters, like debates over original sin and revivalism, and not civil and political issues such as slavery. The boundaries, though, on what constituted political matters, I find that it always remained in flux, such that supporting temperance and resisting women's rights from the pulpit were permissible, that these things were not interpreted as civil and political, but moral. But slavery continued to remain a civil or political institution outside of the church's authority. My point there, it is, for me, I think this is an ongoing challenge. What counts as political and civil, and what counts as moral and ethical and things that Christians can address and what churches can do? But what I will say there, though, is I am mindful of, now it's kind of a long classic book that I don't think seminary students and maybe even new pastors read anymore, but back in the day, and I think some of the ministers here will laugh, there was this book from William Willimon and Stanley Hauerwas called Resident Alien. And it's a book about how to be Christian kind of in the United States. And I find one thing they wrote, I find true today in 2025. They said, certainly, churches should be politically involved and engaged because it is about human rights and it is about Christian witness in the world. But churches should not have a voice that is just like either the political right or the political left. That there should be a distinctive theological voice and witness that comes from the church that is not what one would hear from politicians and from political advocacy groups, but that one would hear that addresses what is going on, but with the gospel of Jesus Christ in prayerful discernment and biblical interpretation. I do like it. I do like their point that it's not good if the church sounds just like the political right. But then they write, knowing that really their audience is, it's also not good if the church sounds just like the political left. That there is something about the gospel that must be distinctive. And I do think they're writing it in a way that they're not trying to be triumphalistic and better than, but it is addressing what's going on. But nonetheless, this continues to be a challenge for us. I will say, so we're talking here, the commissioners almost unanimously sided with Thornwell and the committee. 168, do I have it here? Yeah, 168 voted with them and only 13 voted against them with 3 abstentions. So I'm not the first historian to note that this was a stunning result that really shows whose church the Presbyterian Church became. It really became a church that some say, even though the numbers were more than the Northern Church, it became a Southern church in terms of kind of its influence and its streams. It became a pro-slavery church, others would argue. But I think this was kind of what's going on. And the Thornwell also wrote his wife after the results, and he just delighting that they were able to do this, particularly in Cincinnati, a city that Thornwell wrote was a stronghold of abolitionism. And Thornwell wasn't wrong on that because of the strong, formidable presence of anti-slavery activism there. Although Thornwell did not receive public recognition for his leadership, since he was not a formal member of the special committee, he received a greater honor 2 years later when he was elected moderator of the General Assembly in 1847 at the age of 34, making him the youngest person to hold that position in the denomination's history to that point. In his survey of pro-slavery literature, Kenneth M. Stamp, in a now classic book, The Peculiar Institution, contends that pro-slavery writers did not sufficiently deploy the most persuasive argument in their arsenal, the economic one. Stamp finds that religious defenses, such as those presented by Thornwell and others, they were actually disputable, that there really was a way to combat these arguments, that they were not like foolproof, if you will. But in the 1850s, Stamp writes, it was clear that, quote, the slave was earning for his owner a substantial, though varying surplus above the cost of maintenance, end quote, and that slavery continued to produce significant financial gains for many white persons throughout the northern and southern states. Stamp's work illumines Henry Ward Beecher, my earlier recollection, that commerce abhorred abolitionism. Again, it's that threefold. Churches dreaded it, parties hated it, and commerce abhorred it. But perhaps it also does explain what was happening in churches as well. I think just to share that. Another thing I'll quickly share before moving on is that at one level, Stamp's not wrong. The economic arguments, he's saying, it's odd that they didn't, I'm kind of paraphrasing and reading in. It's odd that they didn't, when you survey pro-slavery literature, it's odd that it is not predominantly economic. It is odd. Larry Tice wrote this in 1987 in his book on pro-slavery literature, History of It, that over half of all pro-slavery literature was written by Christian clergy, that pastors were actually among the most prolific pro-slavery writers. So why? In part because the abolitionist movement was appealing to the Bible, and it was appealing to resources and moral thought and philosophies in the Christian tradition. I don't want to say that the abolitionist movement was entirely a Christian movement, but many of the most prominent and influential and significant abolitionists were Christian and advancing Christian arguments. Frederick Douglass argued from the Bible often. William Lloyd Garrison argued from the Bible often. Sojourner Truth, they made biblical appeals. So if they're making all of these biblical appeals, what is required of pro-slavery defenses? That they too also, and this is the tragedy of it, not the big tragedy. The big tragedy is or was the ongoing enslavement of black women, men, and children. But another tragedy is the ways in which it influenced Christian ministry. Because you had the abolitionist movement, you had Garrison and Douglass, these fierce orators saying slavery is wrong and God condemns it. It's not part of the golden rule. We can't do this as Christians. So the defenses also had to be from ministers. And sadly, in the southern states, it was actually, I make this argument in the book that's coming out, one of the most viable pathways to not faithful, but successful ministry. How does one become a prominent minister in the southern states after 1830? It is by acquiring a voice and a skill for defending slavery as strongly and as rhetorically excellent and convincing as the abolitionists did. And so we see that, and we see that throughout, and so that was happening. So, but the point I want to share here for us, it is to note, this is the English sociologist, I think credited to being the first woman sociologist, a pioneer in the 1830s from England, Harriet Martineau. I don't think her her travelogues of the United States are as well known as de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, but she wrote, I think, 2 or 3 volume kind of books about her experiences in the United States in the 1830s. And she writes some about slavery and Christianity. And she makes this observation, and I think it's important for us to keep in mind. Martineau noted that some of the most admirable individual abolitionists that she met were Presbyterian. But she notes the irony that the institutional church was fiercely and thoroughly pro-slavery. Like, how could it be that some of the best men and women I meet who are against slavery and fighting against it are Presbyterian, yet the capital C church to which they belong is so evil and nefarious? That's what she was wrestling at. In 1834, for example, I have it here. This is not from her book, but this is the minutes from the American Anti-Slavery Society, the AASS, which Garrison helped to found, which was the largest national kind of abolitionist movement right here in New York City. To note that black and white Presbyterians comprised at least 6 of the 12 members of the AASS's executive committee. And so it is to note. So you can see there, Arthur and Lewis Tappan, they were, I think, silk merchants and Presbyterian laymen. They were influential and they were leaders in it. John Rankin and Samuel H. Cox or white Presbyterian pastors. Theodore Wright, you can see his name there. And I think, is it Cornish? And you might see Samuel E. Cornish. Those are 2 black Presbyterian ministers. So that's 6 right there. So it is to note that there was a bevy and a wealth and a plethora of examples, witness, faithfulness, goodness, but I also will say, but resources in the Reformed tradition. One argument, I think, and sometimes I wish I made it stronger in the book that came out in 2022, is that there is nothing inherent in the Reformed tradition that suggests that it should lean towards defending slavery. The problem wasn't Reformed theology. The problem wasn't like Reformed Christianity. The problem of everything what was happening here and why the Presbyterian Church, capital C as a denomination, became pro-slavery wasn't because they were frozen chosen and didn't care about what was happening in civic society and the like, and their worship wasn't vibrant and passionate enough. It wasn't any of that. It was because of their ties to what was happening politically and economically. It was their context. But what I want to say there is that context is an explanation. It's not an excuse, right? It explains. As a historian, I'm seeking to explain what happened. I'm not seeking to excuse it. And so the point here I share at churches such as this and others is that there is so much. There's a wealth of resources and goodness and righteousness, mercy, and love in our denomination, in our ministers, past, present, and future, in our churches, past, present, and future, that we too can continue to make the church and the world a better place. These are some of our heroes. These are some of their witnesses, and it is inspiring. But the fullness of history also infuriates us, because we know that there are other witnesses and ancestors that were uninspiring, if downright unfaithful and evil in what they did. And I end the first chapter of what kind of Christianity with what helped me in my own research, just a haunting passage from William Wells Brown, a formerly enslaved man from the Midwest, and who became one of the most accomplished authors in the 19th century. In his memoir, he recalls his encounters with the white pastor of his enslavers' Presbyterian congregation. So he says, my owner was pretty active in the Presbyterian Church, and so he had access and went to the church. And Brown writes in his memoir that I found that the whole aim of the pastor's ministry was to please the slaveholders in the church. And he notes of the pastor, quote, when they, the congregation, wanted singing, he, the pastor, sung. When they wanted praying, he prayed. When they wanted a story told, he told them a story. Brown concluded this part of his book, noting that I don't think the pastor taught any Christian theology to the slave-owning church members, but instead, quote, my master taught theology to him, end quote. Isn't that haunting? That just stopped me in my tracks. Throughout Garrison's life, the abolitionist answered his Christian critics, which included a good number of Presbyterian clergy, by pointing them to the example of Jesus Christ. In 1838, he wrote in The Liberator, quote, if you would make progress, you must create opposition. If you promote peace on earth, array the father against the son and the mother against the daughter. If you would save your reputation, lose it. It is a gospel paradox, but nonetheless true. The more peaceable a man becomes after the pattern of Christ, the more he is inclined to make a disturbance, to be aggressive, to turn the world upside down, end quote. Garrison later added that his tactics were the same actually as the early modern Protestant reformers, Martin Luther, John Knox, and John Calvin. And Garrison noted that every great reform movement must display, I think I've got it here, quote, antagonism to public quietude and good order, and make the whole social, political, and religious structure tremble to its foundation. Garrison, throughout his ministry, his advocacy, his life as a journalist, speaker, and abolitionist, he continued to write and say that he found inspiration from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 9 to 12, and that he too desired to be a, quote, repairer of the breach and restorer of paths to dwell in. But he also noted that it was not possible to be a repairer of the breach and a restorer of the path unless one was also willing to be a disturber of the peace. That this is what it is. This is how he saw life and ministry and activism, and this is what he wanted more Christians to do. He continued to call, and of course, he said it in harsh, abrasive ways, and, right, what do use honey, not vinegar, to get people, and I do kind of get that, and he was a bit of a scold, I will confess. But I think he was a prophet who really did see what was happening, and he did note, and he said slavery is so hard to abolish because it's a foundational sin. It is at the core of this country, and it is at the core of what we do. He says in every country, in every context, core sins are difficult to abolish because they are foundational. But he said again, that's an explanation, that's not an excuse. So what do we got to do? We got to get to the foundations. We got to make them tremble, because this is wrong. This is not becoming of a great nation. This is not becoming of a great church. This is not who we should be. And so he did that, and I find inspiring. Also, he found Isaiah 58:6 quite inspiring, the notion to break every yoke. And in fact, when I read a lot of his correspondence in the 1850s, it was quite heartening to me that he would often end his letters to colleagues and correspondents to break every yoke, William Lloyd Garrison, that's what he wanted to do. So I share all these things to note that it continues to be, I think, it's a gospel paradox, that God wants us to be a people of love and a people of grace, forgiveness, kindness, and mercy. But God also wants us to be a people who will provoke change, a people who will call things out for what they are. That God calls us to love people with all our hearts. But also, what do we do with our bodies, mind, soul, and strength? It is to tell the truth and see it as it is, and to work with people so that we can do what we believe God is calling us to do. So that's it for my, overly long lecture, but thanks for having me here.
Thank you so much. At this time, we are going to do a few a little bit of question and answer time. On your table, you will see that there are some index cards and pencils. We will be doing our question and answer time written. So I'm going to give you a couple moments. We actually, several of us read this book and did a book discussion this past week and had some really a good talk about the book, and so I'm actually going to take the first question from that conversation, and then Natalie. Oh, hi. Natalie is going to come around and collect any questions you have. So if you just wave your little index card in the air, she can come around and do that. So, Dr. Yu, the first question that we had in our book group is throughout your research, and I'm going to include the second book in this as well, but throughout your research for both of these books, how has your faith grown and changed, or how did this research impact your own faith?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think it helped me desire, is it possible to be both deeply honest and deeply hopeful about our past, present, and future? And I do really believe it is. I do believe on the one hand, so I am a historian. I think this is the gift or the passion. This is like, we all have different parts to play, and this is what I do. So it is to really, I do focus more on the past than anything. And that I do want to be deeply honest, and I do want to tell, as faithfully as possible with the resources, the sources that I have, what's there. But I do think in learning that and in reckoning with that, it is possible to be deeply hopeful about where we can go. It is to note that there was a lot of bad. And I think the making of American Christianity, not unlike the making of this country, it is hard to understand it apart from its engagements with, encounters with, and in many cases, injustices toward indigenous peoples, and participation in the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in this country, even after the slave trade was abolished internationally in 1808. But it is to note that all throughout, there were Christians who were perceptive and who were able to tell the truth and see it as it was, and they worked hard to work with others to rally consensus and coalitions that would do the work to undo these big sins, so that we could have a better and more just present and future. But one other thing I'll say, and I end the book that's coming out this way, it is also to note that so many of the indigenous Christians, black Christians, white indigenous rights activists, and white abolitionists that I encounter, their love for God and their love for neighbor was steadfast, but sometimes their faith in the church wavered. And I do want to be honest about that. And they wrestled with deep disappointment in not being able to persuade and convince a critical mass of people, sometimes in their context, to understand, see, pray, think, and do things that they thought were right. But it is to note, and I take this, and I'll end this question this way. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I know we're here this Sunday, today and tomorrow. One part of his letter from Birmingham City Jail, he does note that, so he said, now I've been around the block. I've been traveling through the southern states, and I see all of these big white churches and all the activities that are going on there, all of the people that are there, and all of the wealth, quite frankly, that is there. And sometimes, he says, I ask myself, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? I think I'm quoting directly from King's letter. And then he says, and I weep tears when he thinks about that. But he notes that these are tears that come from a deep love of the church. These are tears that come because I have deep love. I am the son and grandson of a minister and the like. But not only that, not only his own ministerial call, but it is love and this belief that God is good and that God is faithful and that God is calling us. And so that really does help me, that sometimes I too, and you too, and many of us too, we wrestle with grief and deep disappointment. But that grief and that disappointment, I think, is anchored in deep hope and deep love. So that's what I've learned from kind of my own research and thinking about my faith.
All right. Another question from the group here. Are there significant archival disparities in the record between white Presbyterian churches and black Presbyterian churches? And how do you see that in your research?
Oh, I don't. So in terms of archival research and the like, so one thing I can share is that, and this was throughout the southern states in the antebellum period, and one thing that kind of helps me get at consciousness and what was going on is that in church records, and even in correspondence, even private correspondence, white Presbyterian churches and pastors and the like, they really did favor and almost exclusively use the word servant and not slave. Like for church members, when you see it in the record, we have 180 communicants, and of those communicants, 50 are domestic servants and the like. And it is even when they write one another and write about it, they do say, my servants. And it is in some ways this recognition, even their own discomfort, to call it what it is or what it was, and to present it. And in some ways, some of it, I don't want to say all of it, one of it was kind of how do you interpret this word doulos in the Greek New Testament that defended slavery. Servant was one translation, others said it was slave. But even there, again, so that's one where I do see kind of understanding, even the ways in which they themselves, white Southern Presbyterians, they were not the only ones, and they didn't invent the term, but they appeal to slavery as it's our peculiar institution. And they even said when the churches divided at the Civil War, the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America, they did said, God has given us a peculiar mission to evangelize and witness to enslaved black people. And it was that note that even in the peculiar language that on its face, this seems wrong, right? But it's not when you dig down deep and you understand. To them it was God's providence, but really it was kind of national and social cultural context. But so there I do see the ways in which there are some kind of omissions and the ways in which they write about it. But I would say in terms of archival records, I don't, that's a good question. I don't, sometimes it's what's missing. I think in some ways, one thing I'll note is that I do think it is this kind of commitment to truth-telling. So again, and I think this is appropriate because this is MLK Sunday, Dr. King, in that same letter from Birmingham jail, he does note, and he says, again, I think many of us know the white moderates are quite challenging to us because they tell me wait, and they say, just be patient, it'll happen. They know it's wrong, but don't do anything about it. But he notes and he says, but there are allies, there are white allies. And he actually names 6 people. James McBride Dabbs is a white Southern Presbyterian who's one of them. He names 3 men and 3 women. Ann Wall is a woman in Kentucky. And one thing I said, so I started reading these people, and some of them were pretty like frontline activists on the way, but 2 or 3 of them, they were really authors, white authors, and really what they did is they just told the truth about what was happening in the southern states, for example. They were not like out and loud, proud activists, but they wrote memoirs and books that really did address the sins and the problems and the horrors of Jim Crow racism and the legacy of slavery. And so in that, what I find there is that, like, that's what Dr. King appreciated of them, is that they told the truth. Because once you tell the truth about something, then you can cut through the lies and you can do something about it. So I will say that's one thing that, even in the period of slavery and abolition, that I do think black abolitionists and black leaders, let's say from 1850 through 1950, they did appreciate about those white kind of leaders, authors, Christians, and others too, who really were good at naming and telling the truth about what it was. Because what they found was in so much of the literature and conversation, there were just a lot of omissions and a lot of ways to get around the problem and sin of racism.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. This question is about how you got to this point. What was it in your life, or what made you interested in this as a topic for research that kind of jump-started you here?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I think, and some of this is like providential, or in the sense for all of us, that God gives us passions and desires for different subjects, topics, and the like. For example, I have a 16-year-old and now 14-year-old. They're in 11th and 8th grade. And they're good at school and everything, but I'll say, man, both of them, they hate history. They think it's so boring, and like they're really good at math, and they're like math whizzes. I feel so bad because, like, even starting in 9th grade, and now my son, my 8th grader, he's like doing 9th grade. Like, they bring home math like homework, and I can't help them at all. I don't know how to help them at all. It's like I'm like watching Khan Academy videos on my phone. Oh yeah, let's try this, because I don't know. But they, different subjects. So for me, history was always from a young age, from a school age. That's just what I loved. That was what was sparked in that interest in me. And so in American church history was really what I wanted to study. And so in studying that, Jamie, and to all of us, it is just wanting to understand what happened, how it happened, how did we get this way, and how to tell stories and how to write stories that are truthful and that are full and that are lively and that capture the past, again, as well as one can. We don't have time machines. We can't do it perfectly. And so that was really the interest. And in that interest, it's just hard to avoid slavery and racial prejudice. So sometimes and this is not here, some places people say, you do like talk and write a lot about like racism. And so for me, I would say one is, in these books, really it is I'm writing about history, and I'm writing about slavery, and I'm writing about, in this new book, The Trail of Tears, and what really happened in Virginia, in Jamestown, and Plymouth, in Massachusetts. And in that, certainly, in these larger phenomena, racial prejudice does rise to the surface. So what I would say is that I'm not looking for racism, I'm just looking for history. And in looking for history, it is hard for one not to see racism and slavery and its legacy, for example, even in Jim Crow segregation, as so central to the story. So sometimes people ask, why don't you write about other things? And I would say, really, the point would be, and certainly I am interested in other things, and I get the intersectional commitment and the like. But really in these time periods, this is what I'm studying, and it's just impossible for me. I did not set out to get a PhD and to be a church history seminary professor to make my mark on racism. I just didn't. I didn't set out to do that. I just set out to try to be as good a historian I could be, as good as understanding, for example, as a denominational historian in the work that I do that's tied to Presbyterianism. I just want to do it well. And so this is what comes to the fore. I want to understand American Christianity and its past. In the same way, one would argue, it's not possible to understand the founding and the making of this country without understanding how did all this land get acquired? How did all this wealth and labor get acquired? It's not possible. How did the Constitution come to be? What is the Three-Fifths Compromise, and why is it there? It's not possible to understand this without, at some level, getting at racial prejudice, discrimination, and these larger, unjust racial sins. And so I would say the same thing about American Christianity. You can't do it without that. Not just be fatalistic and say that defines everything and everything is ruined, but to say this was part of the making. And in that, there's a lot of liberation, a lot of good, and a lot of hope. But there's also a lot of bad stuff too, and I want to better understand all of it.
Thank you. I'm a little shorter than he is. Thank you so much, Dr. Yu, for everything today, for joining us. This has been very helpful, very enlightening. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone.